In this video I'll be giving a brief overview of the IGCSE CIE history course. I'll be giving an overview of the first topic, which is were the peace treaties of 1919 to 23 fair. This is part of the option B section, which is about the 20th century. The other section, option A, is about the 19th century. If you're planning on doing the real exam, you won't have to do both of the sections. You can choose to do either one of the two. So you can do either option A or B, but I'll get into more detail about the structure of the exam and how to answer the questions of the exam later on in a different video. For now, I'll just be talking about the first point for option B, which is were the peace treaties of 1919 to 23 fair. Again, I'll be going into depth on these topics later on, especially this topic, because this is just an overview, so there's going to be not a lot of detail for the moment, but I think it should cover most, if not all, the important points that you need to know for the exam. The first thing you need to know about is World War I. So again, if you don't know about that already, I'll try and cover that in a separate video. So don't worry about it too much at the moment, but you don't need to know too much about the war, just the basics of it. So the first thing you need to know in this is the big three, their aims, who they were, and why they couldn't achieve all of their aims. So you can see a photo of them. So if we're going from right to left, Wilson is on the right, Clemenceau, and then Lloyd George. Wilson was the American president at the time, Clemenceau was the French prime minister, and Lloyd George was the British prime minister. Wilson, compared to the rest of them, he is the most idealistic, the most principled person. He already had, before the treaty, set out to try and lay out a guideline for what he had hoped the peace to be, and that was his 14 points. There were a series of points that he believed that would encourage world peace and would ensure that the peace would last for a long time. Now these included things like establishing the League of Nations, which would be the UN of the past, freedom of navigation, decolonization, and so on and so forth, self-determination. You can get the idea that he's, a very idealistic person just from this. Clemenceau, on the other hand, he wanted to be hard on the Germans. He didn't care a lot about it being fair or any of Wilson's idealistic goals. He wanted to ensure that France would be safe. To give you an idea of how harsh he was, he wanted to establish a buffer state between France and Germany in the Rhineland. Now the Rhineland's a state that borders the two countries. So yeah, he was nicknamed the Tiger for how harsh he was against the Germans. So keep that in mind. That will come useful later on if you need to write anything about him. Now, Lloyd George is the most realistic, most pragmatic out of all three. So he took a more moderate stance, but before he had one on the campaign promise of hanging the Kaiser. The Kaiser was the emperor of Germany, the ruler of Germany. He had been exiled now. He fled to Holland after the end of the war, and now Germany was a democracy. But you can understand that he would have to be harsh on Germany to an extent, and he did set up a committee to look into putting reparations on Germany. But he also understood the importance of allowing Germany to recover. He understood that it would benefit the economic recovery of Europe, and that they could also use Germany as an ally against communism, and that if they were too harsh, Germany might become communist. So they didn't want that at all, and so that's why Lloyd George was more pragmatic out of all of them. Also, you have to consider that Wilson was also a lot more detached from the fighting because he had joined the war very much later on. Clemenceau and Lloyd George were in Europe at the time, so they directly saw the effects of the war, especially Clemenceau, who had made the German delegation drive through villages that had been destroyed during the war by the Germans. So there was a sense of inequality in that, Wilson had come in with all of his idealistic ideas while he himself hadn't experienced the war and seen what it was, what effects it had on the people, like the years of trench warfare and so on and so forth. So you have to keep that in mind. And so in the end, none of them got everything they wanted. Some of them got some things, but they all had to compromise. Like, for example, Wilson, he couldn't get things like freedom of navigation or decolonization or world disarmament, but he got things close to it. Like, he got the League of Nations, he got self-determination in the Tsar after a set number of years, so it's not exactly what he wanted, so he probably lost out the most. It's either him or Clemenceau. Clemenceau also lost out a lot because he wanted to be extremely harsh on Germany, cripple them completely. He did get some things like the demilitarization of Germany and the disarmament of them, like a cap on their armed forces and restrictions placed on their military, but that wasn't enough for the French people, and he'd eventually get voted out by them. So Lloyd George is probably the most happiest out of the three. The only thing he's really unhappy about is the fact that ethnic Germans are now living under the control of newly formed nations like the Czechs or Poland. This could lead to further tensions in the future, which would be bad for Europe, but overall the Germans weren't too punished, and the punishment they got was enough for the British people, so he is probably the most happiest out of the three. Now we'll talk about the impacts of the treaty, like what it did. So most of the treaties were similar. They had restrictions on the military, like a cap on the number that were allowed to serve. They all had to accept war guilt. They had to accept to pay reparations. Some countries, like Austria, were forbidden to unite. Some countries had demilitarized zones, like Germany and Turkey. So there are some common threads running around all of the treaties. It's not all completely different. Now, the Germans had to accept total blame for the war as a result of Article 231. So they had to accept that they were the ones who had caused the war and they're responsible for the war and things like that. They had to pay reparations, but the number wasn't decided yet at Versailles. It would be decided in 1921, and the figure would turn out to be 6.6 billion pounds. They also lost approximately a third of their land in Europe, including Alsace-Lorraine and the Sudetenland and Danzig, to various countries, and also some other parts like Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium and parts of northern Schleswig to Denmark. But with this, they lost all of their colonies overseas. You can imagine they might not be too happy about it, which we'll get to later on. Now, onto the opinions of the people. Now, most of them, they either felt completely against the treaty, that it was too harsh or not harsh enough, or they thought it was good enough for what it was at the time. So the British, for example, they had mixed opinions about the treaty. Some thought it was too harsh, some thought it wasn't harsh enough, some just felt it was okay given the circumstances at the time. The French, generally, again, as I mentioned previously, they thought it was harsh enough, so eventually they vote out Clemenceau. The Americans, well, Wilson thought it was the best that could be achieved at the time, but there they wanted to become more isolationist, so the Senate wouldn't ratify the treaty, so America wouldn't join the League of Nations. Germans thought it was too harsh for them. They'd hold protests and things like that against the Treaty of Versailles. They considered this a betrayal by the democratic government because of how bad the terms were. A lot of politicians and people resigned from important positions. So, in general, in Germany, people were completely against the treaty. They called it a dictated peace, a peace that was forced on them. Meanwhile, there's other countries, but you don't really have to know that for the exam. The only one you really have to remember is Turkey. They were angry at the amount of territory they lost to Greece, which would eventually lead to them going to war with them. And there'd be a new treaty for them, the Treaty of Lausanne, which would replace the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the treaty that dealt with Turkey. Now, the last point on the syllabus is whether all of this was justified. You can choose to believe either point because it's subjective. You could argue that it was justified because it was the best thing that could have been done at the time, or that Germany could have imposed harder terms on the Allies because of what you've seen in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was harsh on the Soviets. Or you could say that no, it wasn't justified, it was too harsh on Germany, they lost too much land, Germans were displaced and things like that. You know, it would slow down the economic recovery of Europe. Germany was one of the major British trading partners, and they traded all over Europe, so you have to keep that in mind if they're crushed too badly, because they might do things that Western Europe might like. They might descend into anarchy, so very bad things for the German could happen. Also, they were in no economic position to be able to pay for the reparations. They had issued a lot of war bonds during the war, so they couldn't afford to pay for them, and eventually it would lead to hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, but we'll get to that later. You could also argue that it's too arbitrary because, again, there's not really any point to giving the British and French the German colonies, along with some other nations like Japan. They can't do that while allowing the Tsar self-determination, so you could try and make a case for that. But besides that, that should be a brief overview of all of the topics within the first point. We'll be covering the second point in a later video. So that's it for today, and thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you later. See you later. See you later. See you later.